Today I'm going to be talking about the Unholy Trinity, climate change, conflict, and ill health. And before I go any further, I'll just note for the record that the bio that went around for me said that I was the executive director of Philly, and I should note that I am not. Now, let's start off, though, before we look at this question about the nexus of climate change, conflict, and ill health, because these are emotive and big issues which are difficult to study. I first want to look a little bit at climate change and why people believe in or act on climate change, and also talk a little bit about the burden of proof that science or society ought to require for the prediction of catastrophes like the one that I'm predicting. And then with that grounding, we'll go into looking specifically at whether climate change will act as a threat multiplier for conflict and what the health consequences of that might be. So, climate change will affect pretty much all aspects of people's lives. It degrades the ecosystems on which human societies depend and which are worthy in their own right. It is not good for the economy. It's much cheaper to mitigate than to adapt to substantial climate change. And I've just included this graph on FAO food prices. And that first spike is due to speculation and other things. But the second spike is due to droughts in the US and Russia, Ukraine, that are plausibly linked to climate change. And it's not coincidental that at that time, the Middle East became substantially more tense. And that is timed roughly with the Arab Spring. So climate change isn't good for our environment. It's not good for our wallets. It's not good for our health. I'm sure everyone here knows that. And those in the military are worried that it's not good for our defense either. So climate change, in short, threatens everything pretty much that we care about. And you'd think then that we would be focusing on it more than we are as a society, and more concerned about it. So here's data from 2015 from the Pew Research Center, looking at the proportion of people who say global climate change is a very serious problem. Australia and USA are about equal at around 45% of people saying that. And I don't think it's because we shouldn't interpret this as just the science is tricky. And part of the reason that I would argue that we shouldn't do that is that while Australia and American science education is not what it should and could be, I don't think the science education in Burkina Faso is twice as good. So what's driving people to conceive of climate change as a very serious problem is probably not just their scientific grasp of it. It's other things that are sort of distorting the way they think about it, because we don't really rely on a scientific mental frame to think about it. And that is well illustrated, I thought, by a study by Sturban and Booth Sweeney over a decade ago now. And they looked at MIT grad students. So people who were pretty well selected for being good at science. And they asked about how much greenhouse gas emissions need to decrease to stabilize atmospheric concentrations. And 84% of MIT grad students got this wrong. They got it wrong in various ways, but almost 2/3 got it wrong by answering that greenhouse gas levels could be stabilized while emissions continued to exceed the removal. So the authors of this paper say, these beliefs, analogous to arguing that a bathtub filled faster than it drains will never overflow, support wait-and-see policies, but violate the conservation of matter. Now, conservation of matter is something that one-year-olds pretty well understand, and certainly we'd expect MIT grad students to understand also. So to me, this is further evidence that we're just not seeing it through a completely rational frame. And that's true for me. I did my PhD on climate change and health, and it's become a lot harder to work on that subject post-kids. And the level of cognitive dissonance for me is much higher now. And was high even when I was in consultation with my wife, obviously, deciding whether or not to have kids. So I just want to say that we're not looking at this as a society, logically or scientifically. And yet we seem to rely on science in some ways. And science is interesting because it seeks something close to certainty before accepting that there's a causal link. And this really is exemplified in the quest for a p-value when doing tests of statistical significance of less than 0.05. In other words, if there's a 94% chance that an association is real, it doesn't count. It needs to be more than 95%. And the importance of the consequences of the link that we're studying, whatever it is, are irrelevant. So it doesn't matter if you're studying rat behavior or climate change, we still look for a p-value of less than 0.05. Or phrased another way, science is always focused on avoiding an erroneous conclusion of a causal link. And so really, science is concerned only with a single dimension. And that's not how we operate day to day, although in many people who are not keen to act on climate change will say, well, science isn't 100% worked out. Well, even though it pretty well is. So another way of thinking about big risks is just what we do in our everyday lives. And in that context, we integrate not only the likelihood of something, but the magnitude of the possible consequences. So I was in the public service long enough that I got to do risk analysis using matrices like this pretty much in my sleep. And so there we have likelihood, which more or less reflects the p-value, but then we also have the consequence, and we sort of integrate those two things. Pardon me. Now, I imagine most of you are aware, so I'll go over this quickly. Climate change may not be simply a gradual thing. There are tipping points past which it's very bad news. So one of the positive feedbacks is the loss of albedo. Basically, ice in the world gives us a bit of a free pass with losing heat, which is what we want to do. And gives us a free pass because it reflects a lot of solar energy. As it melts, though, and reveals either water or land underneath, that absorbs a lot more of the heat. And you can see between 1979 and 2017, the extent of sea ice loss. Now, we're also doing very bad things to forest carbon sinks. So that destruction of the environment that I mentioned earlier really is coming back to bite us in lots of ways, and the destruction of forest carbon sinks is one of them. And then there's methane release. Now, methane is, as I'm sure you know, a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And the East Siberian Arctic Shelf alone has a 50 gigaton reservoir. It's been calculated that release of this could cause something like $60 trillion worth of damage to the global economy because of the financial consequences of the destruction, the reduced crop growth, etc., increased sea levels, that sort of thing. And $60 trillion, to put that in perspective, is similar to about 9 or 10 months of global economic output. So it would be immensely destructive. Now, writing in Nature, Whiteman and colleagues have indicated that release already appears to be underway, and it could take 50 years, or it could be abrupt. I don't know what abrupt is if 50 years is gradual, but that's pretty bad news. And it's worse news when we look at it in the really long term. Other than the current mass extinction that's going on, there have been 5 great extinctions in our history, and the worst was the Permian. And it was caused, there's some contention, but it looks like it was caused by methane from hydrate being released and warming things really rapidly. And so Brand and colleagues say that global warming triggered by the massive release of carbon dioxide may be catastrophic, but the release of methane from hydrate may be apocalyptic. So basically that's a tipping point that is has the potential to dwarf anything that we do, really, in terms of our gas emissions. And the presence of these tipping points makes it all a bit scarier and a bit harder to predict. And just bear that in mind as we are talking about sort of the psychology of how do we ask questions and what do we look for in an answer. So my basic thesis is that climate change makes violent conflict more likely, and in turn that's bad for health. And really this is composed of 2 propositions. First, that there's a link between climate change and conflict, and that's not self-evident. So we'll need to garner some evidence for that. And the second is that there's a link between conflict and decreased health. And that's really obvious, but I think as we look into it more, we'll find more connections and probably greater effect than we expected to see at first, or than I did at first. Pardon me one moment. Sorry, just turning off the heater in an effort to cough less. So there have been 3 broad ways of testing this first proposition that climate change makes violent conflict more likely. First have been contemporary qualitative explorations. And then people have looked at those same questions quantitatively. And then there have been archaeological and deep historical methods. Now, the challenge for public health is that these 3 literatures talk to each other much less than you'd think. So how do we combine them for the benefit of public health. The qualitative explorations really gave birth to the idea that there's a link between global climate change and violence. And we can simplify it into two camps. One, the pro-link, and second, the anti-link. Now, the literature indicates that there might be three types of conflict that are made more likely. The first is basically a scramble for Arctic resources. With the North Pole melting, that becomes a really strategic trade route, and a bunch of resources, primarily petroleum, are potentially accessible where they weren't before. No one really cared about claims to the North Pole previously, but they do now. And so there is increased military and political tension about sort of Arctic claims. A few years ago, a Russian took a submersible down and planted a flag on the seabed, suggesting that it was all Russia's. And there's some argument that the sort of continental shelf extends for a while off of Russia. China has recently labeled itself, I think the term was, a near Arctic state. And the US responded, and that gets them absolutely nothing, because that doesn't really exist as a category. But China is clearly looking to stake some claim. Second, there are possible conflicts between states over diminishing resources. Water resources are perhaps the most likely early on, and there are a number of river systems where tensions are all have historical precedent. So India and Pakistan's relationship relies in part on a treaty about water rights coming out of the mountains. And it is likely that sort of melting glaciers and altered monsoons from climate change are going to alter that. And so the balance of the compromise that was reached decades ago will be challenged. And as a lot of people in that part of the world become more water insecure, that is a potential real flashpoint for conflict. Similarly, in parts of Africa, some leaders around the Nile have indicated they would go to war over Nile waters. The third type of conflict is civil conflict, and that picture is of a Janjaweed militia fighter, and that's probably gotten the most analysis. So in the qualitative research, there are a number of pathways through which climate change is going to increase conflict or increase the risk of conflict. Broadly, you have a number of bad things happening, like disease spreading, deserts growing, the sea level encroaching on deltas that produce a lot of food, and increased natural disasters. That in turn leads to a number of consequences like migration, resource scarcity, the capture of resources by elites, and people losing their individual or family livelihoods. This in turn leads to population pressure, or sometimes the loss of populations, increased ethnic tensions, economic decline, and political instability, all of which weaken the state. And a weakened state is not good for the risk of conflict in that it enhances it. Because sometimes states promote or exploit violent responses. Leaders who aren't having a whole lot of success on the home front are very happy at times to blame it on someone outside or someone inside. And so you can get scapegoating of minorities and that sort of thing. It also reduces the state's ability to alleviate the symptoms of climate change. So the sort of social compact that states have with their citizens, states simply are unable to fulfill even if they're well governed because of lack of resources. And that's pretty problematic and increases the risk of conflict. So that's a sort of simplified set of causal pathways. Now, there are some scholars who deny a link or are worried about a link. So some have written that if we militarize climate change, then it will be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we should just keep quiet about it. Scholars shouldn't talk about it. They note that, you know, the militaries of the world are saying, yeah, there's an increased risk of conflict due to climate change, but they say, well, you know, the military has a conflict of interest here. They need to justify their budgets, especially post-Cold War, and, you know, justify why there hasn't been the sort of peace dividend that some hoped for after the Cold War. To my view, though, the military's job is to predict conflict, and it's very well resourced to do that, and it has access to information that we probably don't have. And it's also future focused more than the academic literature tends to be. So the academic literature is very bad at scenario planning. And it's because academics like that 0.05 p-value, we're less likely to go out on a limb and say this might happen in the future, especially if there's not a direct historical precedent. So there are sort of fewer taboos in the military, I think. Those in the anti-link camp also accuse pro-linkers of environmental determinism. And say, you know, if you think that the climate controls whether or not people fight with each other, you're an environmental determinist, you know, and that has its roots in quite racist thought 100 years ago, and shame on you. But in my own reading of the literature, I haven't found anything in the academic literature that says that anything quite so bold. So people are pretty clear about saying that climate change is a threat multiplier, not that it and it alone cause conflict, but that it will, climate change, by decreasing the availability of resources, makes, interacts with a bunch of other factors, like how well a place is governed, like pre-existing ethnic tensions, and changes the calculus a little bit towards, or maybe a lot, towards conflict. Now, political scientists have sought to test their theories with numbers, and there really, in my mind, are three challenges to quantitative analysis for predicting the future consequences of future climate change. First, there's the challenge of proxy measures. Climate change of the rate and magnitude that's predicted to occur has not occurred in human history. And so there have been changes, and they are not trivial, but they're really just the beginning. So you can't look back and say, what happened when the climate changed this much before? Instead, you have to come up with proxy measures, and the favored ones tend to include renewable resource scarcity and its causes, such as localized climate change or localized weather disruption. And To me, one thing that's important about that is if you have something localized, then in this very interconnected world, you can sort of divert resources from elsewhere. So I think that's one limitation to the proxy measures that are typically used. The second is the challenge of independent samples. Most of the studies divide the world into countries or other geographic spaces, and also years, and sort of treat country years as though they are independent. But that's, while it's a convenient assumption, isn't actually a terribly statistically sound one, because violence breeds itself. One of the greatest predictors of genocide in a certain place is whether or not genocide has occurred there before. Also because violence spills over borders. Your country is much more likely to go to war if there's a war in the country next door. And you're just more likely to get caught up in that. And the final major challenge to the independence of the samples is that a lot of conflicts were actually Cold War proxy wars, and so not completely independent from each other. And typically studies of this sort look no further back than World War II, so it's a relatively small number of country years. Then there's the challenge of interpretation, because the results across the studies are mixed, and conflict appears to have many risk factors that vary in their strength. So which do you include in your study? And similarly, effect size is frequently not measured. And I'm going to suggest that there's some author bias out there, because sometimes you'll see conclusions drawn from results that seem a little bit counterintuitive. So my tentative, although to be honest it's not that tentative, conclusion is that the better studies tend to find an increased risk of violence. And maybe the best example is a study by Solomon, Chang, and colleagues. They looked at the period 1950 to 2004, and they compared the rates of new civil conflicts during El Nino years to that in La Nina years. And the idea is that El Nino years are hotter and drier, and therefore not a bad proxy for a climate change affected future. They found that the risk during El Nino years was twice as high as during La Nina years. And so they conclude that ENSO may have had a role in 21% of all civil conflicts since 1950. And one of the ways that this is an elegant study, I think, and that they really point out, is that this is a global climate pattern. So some of the problems you get from just having a very localized drought where you can truck wheat over the border or maybe even pipe water over the border are alleviated to some extent. And I would also say part of the reason that my conclusion of my summary of the quantitative studies is pretty firmly in there is a link between climate change and increased conflict, is that when you're testing a bunch of proxy measures which necessarily undermeasure what your the independent variable that you really want to get at, then it's not a surprise that some of your studies don't find a link. In fact, it would be surprising if they all did. So now let's look at archaeology and deep history as a different way of assessing the link between climate change and conflict. the problem of independent samples that we got in recent history is largely solved. And you get genuinely independent samples, both spatially and in time. And also the use of deep time obviates the problem of a sufficiently large number of independent places. We have really good climate data over the long term. And archaeology is good also because I think looking at ruins of a lost civilization exerts a certain emotional power that can influence people. But archaeology and deep history have drawbacks too in terms of examining this question. First is that you lose information about the society. Now, a lot of societies have contemporary written records back a few thousand years, so that mitigates it somewhat in some places. But it's also vulnerable to the modernity is special argument. And so basically the argument here is that we moderns are better able to insulate ourselves from nature. We've conquered nature in a way that no one else before us has. But my response to that is that we're really still subject to environmental constraints, and really what we've done is simply to expand geographically the connections that we have. So instead of one country acting as a sort of closed system, the whole planet now effectively is a single socio-political and perhaps most importantly economic system. So a lot of archaeologists are pretty for the link. Jared Diamond in Collapse talks about the Anasazi in Chaco Canyon, not too far from where I grew up. And it was the capital of this region, and it supported a population so large that it couldn't be locally supported, but they were able to distribute risk and resources over a broader space. And so you had comparatively a dense population. But then you got a regional drought. And so the strategy of distributing risk spatially no longer worked. And in the end, you got a lot more violence. You see a shift in the architecture, much more defensive structures. And there's evidence of violent cannibalism, including basically human tissue in fossilized poo. Now, the ultimate cause of that was sort of increased population pressure, and the proximate cause was drought. But it just shows how the climate can interact with other factors. David Chang and colleagues have used written records of violent conflict in a series of studies, actually, that's really impressive, writing mostly in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. And they compare the records of weather and grain harvest and population size and also conflict. And they find a strong link between these things in China and Europe. Now, I'm not meant to quote at such length, but I found this quote just so compelling and horrifying that I'm going to. They found long-term fluctuations of war frequency and population changes followed the cycles of temperature change. Further analyses showed that cooling impeded agricultural production, pardon me, which brought about a series of social problems, including price inflation, then war outbreak, famine, and population decline successively. The findings suggest that worldwide and synchronistic war, peace, population, and price cycles in recent centuries have been driven by long-term climate change, mainly by long-term climate change. Solomon Chang and colleagues, and if you haven't figured it out, Solomon's one of my intellectual heroes, conducted a meta-analysis of 60 studies looking at the link between climate change and violence. And they found that for each 1 standard deviation change in climate towards warmer temperatures or more extreme rainfall, increases in the frequency of interpersonal conflict by 4%, and intergroup conflict by 14%. So that's pretty substantial. Now, in archaeology, there aren't a whole lot of archaeologists that deny the link between a changing climate and the risk of conflict, though there are a minority of authors that defend their civilizations, the ones they specialize in, from the charge of environmental mismanagement or lack of adaptation. But by and large, they're pretty much in the pro-link camp. And I'll come back to the idea that even if nothing about climate change inherently increases the risk of violence, the mere perception of it could tip the balance a bit. So overall, I think the evidence is pretty good that climate change in future will increase the risk of conflict. Some people have argued, in my mind, pretty persuasively that the Syrian conflict was initiated in part because of climate change. I say in part because there was a massive drought in Syria right before the civil conflict started, but it coincided with a lot of really stupid policies from the Assad regime, which made life much harder for farmers and pastoralists. And so you had these 2 separate pressures on those groups at the same time. And effectively, they just could not make a living as they traditionally had for some period. And the response to that was to send some people into the cities, some family members from many families, and culturally the appropriate choice there was the young men. And so you have a concentration of unemployed young men in the cities who have pretty strong grievances against the state for what I think were legitimately viewed as pretty stupid and unthoughtful policies. And they're looking for work and not finding it. And idle hands are the devil's plaything, as they say. So that helped initiate the civil conflict. And, you know, at the same time, this was when grain prices globally were escalating because of the droughts elsewhere in some of the breadbasket areas of the world that we saw very early on in that graph. So now there's this second proposition that there's a link between violent conflict and decreased health. Well, it's pretty obvious that shooting each other is not good for us. But more than that, conflict hinders efforts to reduce infectious disease. You look at where polio is still around, and it's basically a map of places that have been in conflict for really, really long periods of time. But for conflict, we'd probably have licked polio. You have regional disease and vector control issues. And I note the Ebola outbreak in DRC now is being hindered by conflict. So MSF had to withdraw its people after 2 health professionals were targeted. There were 2 separate attacks. And attacking health professionals in conflict situations is not a rare thing. It was a real pattern in Iraq, such that many health professionals left in the most recent conflict there. And when you rob a population of their health professionals, even if you have the money for health programs, you don't have anyone to implement them. And so there's no monitoring for new or re-emerging diseases. But also, I'm going to go a step further than most of the literature and say, look at conflict and war that's motivated partly by scarce resources. If you're fighting over food, then using food as a weapon makes sense, right? And that leads to undernutrition and resulting disease outbreaks. And if you're fighting over food, if you're fighting over very basic resources, and there are just too many people, then, you know, there's a certain logic where genocide makes sense. It may not make ethical sense, but it certainly makes a form of sense in that it reduces the number of people competing for resources. And you look at a number of recent genocides, and I think the lack of availability of resources and the quest for your neighbor's resources is a motivating factor for at least some of the participants. I saw a film called, or a museum display really, called 7 Billion Others, and it had interviews with people from different parts of the world, and that included Rwanda. And some of the perpetrators of the genocide there were very open about, I killed my neighbor because I wanted what he had. And in fact, Rwanda, prior to the genocide, was experiencing very intense population pressure. And again, you don't want large groups of angry young men, but what was happening was there was not enough land for the young men to move out of the house, which meant that they couldn't get married. So that was a problem. Looking a bit more, there's a link between violent conflict and decreased health, because every society has this balance of swords and plowshares. How much of your money are you going to spend on aircraft carriers, and how much are you going to spend on your health system? And the more conflict happens, the more every country is going to adjust that balance towards swords, frankly. And that robs health systems and the things that support health systems, like education systems, of necessary resources. Another thing that we're likely to see is compassion fatigue. So it's a recognized phenomenon that, you know, as we see more and more war crimes on TV, our sense of outrage, our sense of wanting to do something about that as a population diminishes. And so there are fewer people who are willing to give. And that's going to be exacerbated by the fact that climate change will impede economic growth. Now, a few years ago, when America was experiencing, the GFC, the Republican American presidential candidates were pretty much united in dramatically reducing or ending humanitarian foreign aid. We'll also have less trust between countries, and the least useful strategically, those countries which are least useful strategically, will be in some ways the most vulnerable because they won't have allies. So really, I think we're going to have this self-reinforcing group of several factors. and conflict is one of them. Just before I conclude, I'll tell you the scariest thing I've ever heard, and it was a presentation at the ANU by a person who's high up in the defense establishment. He couldn't wear that hat because he was a public servant and speaking about climate change. And the session, to give you some sense of the gravitas, was chaired by Admiral Chris Berry, who I think some of you know was the chief of the Defense Force previously. Anyway, this military historian was talking about climate change and conflict, and specifically Australia. And he said, you know, we live in a part of the world where there are going to be more than 1 billion people who are looking for another place to live. And Australia is pretty vulnerable. And someone asked him what we ought to do. And he didn't have any really compelling answers, but one of his things was, well, maybe we should increase our planning and defense spending for this scenario. And, you know, it was the ANU. So, of course, there was a student who raised his hand and said, but if we give the military more money, how do we know you're not just going to, you know, sink boats of refugees? And the public servant leaned forward earnestly and said, that's exactly what we'll do. We'll do it because we're in a democracy and that's what the government tells us to do. The problem for the Australian people's perspective will be when we can't sink the boats fast enough. And similar to what I was mentioning about genocide, he, being a military historian, noted that in fact the convention of warfighting, where militaries fight other militaries and try not to kill civilians, is in fact a historical anomaly and not one that we should expect to persist if things get bad. So, back to risk assessment. The consequences for health and other things that we hold as important of climate change associated conflict are pretty severe. If I were in my public service hat, I would have to rate it as severe. My own assessment of the likelihood of how much conflict will be increased, or will conflict be increased due to climate change, is that it's almost certain. Maybe it's already happened in Syria. Will it happen catastrophically, apocalyptically? My assessment is it's possible. Maybe even likely if we don't get our act together with emissions pretty soon. But I recognize there are other people who study this who think maybe it's possible. A few probably who think it's unlikely, but I think most would say, well, it's possible. Or most of the anti-link camp, they'd say, well, you know, we don't have anything like a p-value of less than 0.05, but, you know, I'm not going to exclude it. But if you note on this chart, if you have a severe consequence, and it's even a possibility, you rate the risk as severe, as extreme. Even if you think it's unlikely or rare, you rate it as high, and you do a whole lot to deal with it. So all of this is a fairly depressing prognosis. But there is a prescription. We can diminish risk by diminishing the rate at which we're changing the climate. I think public health practitioners have a real role. If there is an issue with letting the military just talk about climate change and risk and what that might mean for conflict and Are we just handing the military a big bucket of money? I think the role for public health practitioners is very real in that context, because we want to have other voices in this debate. Personally, I'm a bit less cynical about the role of the military, but regardless, there's a clear role for us, the PHAA. And, health practitioners were really important in nuclear disarmament, to the tune of a Nobel Peace Prize. And we can play a similar role. So there is a small upside to the risk. Thank you. Apologies for not being my most coherent. My cold is impeding my thinking a bit.
No, thanks, Devin. That was depressing, but good.
Thank you.
Really good. Slightly terrifying. Definitely a little bit shook at this end. So usually at this point, we open the floor to some conversation, some questions, some discussion. I'm just going to try and open my videos up again so I can see everybody. There we go. Okay, good. We've got a good few people on. Okay, so I'm going to open up. I'm going to mute again myself because there's a lot of background noise here. But yeah, fire away on questions, people. Thank you, Devin.
Sure.
We're all sort of reeling from the implications as we think it through.
Mm.
Well, yes, I mean, one thought that I had is this definitely ties in with the work that I've been doing on the climate refugee topic, really, and the scariest thing that you ever heard regarding the boats coming. I mean, by 2050, that's set to be reality for the likes of Kiribati and Tuvalu, who are predicted to be uninhabitable by then. And I have to kind of can only hope that they can get on the boats from the state of affairs of lack of planning for them currently. And so I think we're going to be seeing this soon.
Yes, and actually I've read one interesting proposal that as a number of the Pacific Island states become uninhabitable, that New Zealand in particular should say, we've got room for 10,000 more. That's fine. Why don't you all move and we'll take your UN vote?
Well, yes, I believe that New Zealand are indeed putting together some sort of treaty to that effect. New Zealand is small, and I think 10,000, it covers Tuvalu, but I think Kiribati is about 100,000, and then there's more on top.
Yes, and that will be tricky to deal with, but can be done. I guess the issue is going to be when India becomes more water scarce than it is, or parts of China become physically incompatible with life during human life during part of the year, minus air conditioning.
And Bangladesh, similarly.
Yeah.
Bangladesh are already overwhelmed with the Rohingya refugees, so there'll be double refugees plus the Bangladeshis.
Yes. So it's it's very much there's a nexus there, and I hinted at that, I hope, with one of those last slides. But and the other side is 2018 set records for the number of displaced people because of, in large part, the conflict in Syria. And a number of those people went to Europe, although really a minority. I think much more stayed closer to home. But conflict from climate change is likely to lead to massive human displacement. And that will be particularly the case if we do start seeing efforts at genocide and the like. I mean, in some ways, you don't care if the people are all killed or if they just go away, as long as they leave you with the resources. Yes, as the Rohingya show, you don't have to kill that many people to get a whole lot more to move. Not to minimize the plight of the Rohingya, but it shows the power of fear, really.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And I think more than half of that population now have crossed the border. But I mean, I suppose the question is, the resounding question is, what can we and what do we do? I mean, currently in the climate refugee sphere, without even taking into account conflict, which will obviously increase that even further, I've done a couple of background papers with Peter, and I've mocked up the policy, but that's currently stalled at the International Health SIG, because obviously it's crossing into their territory.
Yeah.
But they think that we need to just have a refugee policy that flat out covers everybody. And so there's a little bit of discourse there at the moment in terms of, Peter and I would argue that climate refugees need a separate category because of the lack of legal recognition. But even going further than that, I mean, this isn't just climate refugees, this is mitigating conflict. And right now we've got another Liberal government in. And it's the same in the UK and it's the same in America, and nobody's really putting climate at the forefront, and yet we're on a 30-year time limit, really. Not even that.
Yeah. I'm not sure I'd give us that long even, but yeah, it's pretty dire. And, you know, I think our generation in the West just is not accustomed to situations in which there are only bad options, but we will rapidly find ourselves there. Yeah.
I mean, I've just done the Sustainable Population for Australia policy, which was supposed to be based on a background document, but I'm stalled with the background document because there is just so much complexity in thinking about population as an issue. And what your talk tonight has introduced is the idea that, I mean, population is yet another factor in this whole situation, and it works both ways. So having a large population becomes a barrier to adaptation, but also makes you more vulnerable to the effects. Let me just write that down while I'm remembering it. And at the same time, doing something about reducing population then becomes one of the things that need to be done, because of course the fewer people, there's fewer strain on diminishing resources, because ultimately what climate change is doing is changing carrying capacity. And so the move across into violence is just the consequence of what happens when you exceed carrying capacity, and whatever the species it is trying to access the resources that the individuals of that species need.
Yeah, and
which is putting a very intellectual twist on the whole conversation, but yeah.
Yes. It's funny hearing you summarize that. Part of me thinks actually you want a big population to start with so that you can have a lot of people killed in the wars.
And win.
Or at least not have a whole continent with only 25 million people on it. But I take your point.
But see, that's part of the here is that, you know, the carrying capacity of Australia once you take trade out of the mix, because trade, of course, allows you to move some of your carrying capacity internationally.
Yeah.
I mean, it means you're stealing somebody else's carrying capacity. But once you take trade out of the mix, we are probably exceeding the carrying capacity of the continent, because a lot of the continent, well, particularly with our form of agriculture, it just doesn't work. I mean, if you read Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu, well, he would argue that the carrying capacity could probably be a whole lot higher if we went back to Aboriginal, ways of sustenance and agriculture. But even then, I don't think the continent can carry 25 million people, much less 100 million people.
Well, maybe not sustainably, but I guess it's still going to look pretty attractive compared to many of our neighbors soon. And
yeah,
if your choice is, well, I can die now, or I can try to get to a place where, they can't sustain their population long term, but I'm not going to die immediately, I probably pick B.
Well, that's right. And I think, that is the John Marsden, The Day After, or the War, whatever it was, series, The War, The Day After Tomorrow.
When the war began.
Yeah. Where, the idea wouldn't be to just subjugate us, it would be actually push us off the south end into the ocean and take over.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And then from the Australia point of view, if we were to increase our population to its absolute maximum carrying capacity, then you've really got to think of the impact on Australia's First Peoples as well, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, who undoubtedly would be disproportionately affected by this. But again, we're talking survival mode, really, aren't we? We're talking global human survival at this stage, which sounds dramatic when I say it out loud. I sort of feel like I'm being a bit of a drama queen there, but that's ultimately what it comes down to. If you've got people crossing in to other countries in those sorts of numbers, in that sort of desperation, with the mindset of, well, I'd rather do that and survive a bit longer than die here and now because my island's sunk or we've got no food or water or whatever, then it is survival.
Yeah, and I actually think the Pacific Islands, I'd rather be an ecological or climate change refugee from there, because one, it's really obvious that it's climate change. If your island's underwater, what can you do? But the other thing is, the populations are comparatively small and therefore seen as not threatening, and therefore I think more likely to be accepted somewhere. Whereas, Bangladesh in 50 years is going to be exceeding its carrying capacity by, I'm going to guess, a whole lot more than all of the Pacific Islands put together, maybe by a factor of 10 or 100. And so you can say, yeah, we'll let in the people of Tuvalu, but it's if you start letting in people from Bangladesh or any number of other populous countries, where do you draw the line with them? It's much easier to be threatened by them.
Well, yeah, you're right. I've got no counter argument for you at all. But again, what do we do? And certainly from the PHAA point of view, I mean, obviously none of us have a magic wand and we have a Liberal government, but we can advocate and we can spread the word. And I actually think that a lot of people here the climate change and the diseases and the heat and everything else. Less so they hear about the refugees, but they still hear about it, particularly over here with the Pacific Islanders. But even less so is the conflict. I think that maybe that's a message that we need to be trying to get out, that, you know, it's not just disease, heat, everything else, but it's actually conflict and war.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, I think, because there was one study that basically looked at how do you frame climate change to get people to act. And they found that framing it as a health issue was more effective than framing it as a military security issue. And I think, you know, we don't like to think of ourselves as, or our kids as having our health affected. But it seems like something, you know, oh, well, it wouldn't be me, it wouldn't be my kid, I can buy an air conditioning or whatever. Whereas the possibility of, you know, large-scale conflict is scarier. And I think the scariness of climate change already causes a lot of people not to engage with it. So, yeah, I'm kind of two minds about sort of spreading the word about conflict. You know, on the one hand, I think people ought to know, and in theory, I think you should give people information that's relevant to their future. But on the other hand, it may not be the best frame. But on the third hand, if I'm honest with myself, I want Australia to have a sufficiently robust military to deter invasion, or to allow us to win a total war, which is a war where you are fighting for your existence, rather than lose. And maybe that means scaring people, but it also means sort of participating on some level in a war effort. And because, you know, war efforts are about bringing people together behind the idea of the war. And so I'm morally conflicted on that point.
You see, I don't agree with you there. I have to say, I suppose, a peace-loving hippie might be a colloquial way of putting it. But I think that we should let people, you know, in a desperate situation, obviously, we are talking about desperate situations now, we should let people in and try and share what we have as best as we can. It's not their fault any more than it's our fault as individuals that we're in this situation. That said, I think it would be wrong to not give all the information out there, because, you know, let's say that this still remains a little known consequence of climate change, and then suddenly in 10, 15 years time, we're in the position where it's starting to come into fruition and conflict starting to ensue. I think people would be pretty unhappy that they didn't know that this was a potential threat.
Yeah, but they'll be unhappy on a lot of grounds.
True.
Okay, look, just I'm aware that Roscoe and Steffi are here. I'm just wondering if Roscoe and Steffi want to jump in and either say something or ask something at this moment.
Hi, Peter. Can you hear me? I just have to check I can work this thing.
I can hear you.
Yeah,
Hi,
we can hear you.
Look, thank you very much. That's been a really thought-provoking and disturbing session for me to listen to. And I really appreciate the perspectives that are coming out. I suppose I'm coming back to something that Peter mentioned around population, and the sort of the banner that we're using is climate change, and we've got this whole dialogue going around that, but there's also this other thing which is pure ecosystem degradation and, you know, exceeding the carrying capacity of the globe. And I'm just interested to know what people think about whether that that discussion would advance the cause more than the one about climate change per se.
That's a very interesting idea. And I think that discussion has some advantages and disadvantages. Just off the top of my head, ecosystem degradation generally can feel like it is something that you can control more locally. And I think having an increased locus of control is probably good for getting people to act. So that seems like a pretty big advantage to me. A couple of downsides are that it's you might not think that it applies to you or to your area. And to some extent, we do outsource a lot of our environmental degradation. And the second downside is, I think there's some ambiguity about the clock with climate change and when we're going to hit those tipping points. But we know pretty well we need to act pretty immediately. And I don't think, I think a lot of the population on some level understands that. And I don't know that that's the case yet for environmental degradation more generally. I don't know, what do other people think?
Yeah, I mean,
I think this idea of being able to give people... Sorry, Roscoe, say again?
No, carry on, Peter, please.
I was just going to say this, this idea about giving people a sense that they have some control is really important to get them to take action, because while they have a sense that it's all too big and beyond them, that's a turn-off. And so, and I think in parallel, some people do get the idea that the ecosystem and the environment they're living in isn't quite the way they'd like it to be, and whether that's the natural environment or the natural environment as it infuses the built environment is something people can relate to. Now, there are a lot of people, but I haven't done the surveys, who possibly don't give the natural environment, even in cities, much attention. But my feeling is that it's a way in. But even people who live in cities who aren't really thinking about natural environment, they still perceive that the world is not quite all right. And so I think it becomes for us a question about how do we latch onto whatever it is that people think it is that's not right, and then generalize that into, okay, well, how can you take action about that? Recognizing that all these little sources of action across a whole lot of issues hopefully will be sort of moving society in the right direction.
Yeah. One other thing that came to my mind in the discussion before was just an odd fact that popped into my mind that I'd learned some 20 years ago about the global control of water supplies, and how, Devon's mentioned how that can become a trigger for conflict. But the figure was that Unilever, it was at the time, a big multinational, controlled somewhere between 1% and 3% of the global water supplies in its prime agricultural areas. And they sort of, their whole contractual basis for agricultural production also involved controlling the means of the production. And I wondered what that, it sort of conjured up this private enterprise being a player feeling for me, and I wondered whether there's room for advocacy in that space, whether anybody's already thought of this and what the possibilities look like. I don't quite know. Has anyone any thought on that?
I mean, while Devon's thinking, I mean, the same thing with Coca-Cola Amatil. If you look at the volume of water that gets used by Coca-Cola Amatil in Australia, I can't remember the numbers, but it dwarfs the amount of water that private households use. But as to your question about what role the corporate sector has in water specifically, but more generally, managing the sort of the whole ecological degradation subset climate change as well aspect is quite fraught, because they're in the capitalist system, and the capitalist system is designed to, you know, extract resources and sell them to people. And if they're not buying enough to make them buy more. So in a way, the tension within the corporate sector, even if they are trying to be green bottom line, is that their fundamental systemic foundations are in antithesis to that. So it's a really difficult question.
And I think to add to that a little, there's maybe a case for not looking at the corporate world as a monolith. So a lot of insurance companies will do better if climate change is limited. If you're not optimistic about that and you believe much of what I had to say earlier this evening, I suggest you buy shares in Blackwater if it is publicly listed. There are, you know, the defense sector is huge business, and they will stand to gain quite a bit.
That's depressing. Thank you.
I mean, one of the things my partner's into is watching scary YouTubes. And so the whole sort of collapse of civilization, her last couple of weeks has been on preppers and looking at what preppers are doing. And interestingly enough, ABC TV last night had a whole thing on Swedish preppers, although they're more worried about the Russians than climate change. But it is this interesting thing that if the whole system falls over, then shares in Blackwater won't actually exist anymore, but it'll be whoever owns the infrastructure and the weapons. And I think it comes back to some basic public health principles that, you know, there's this tension between the military aphorism of hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and the public health principles of, you know, primordial prevention, primary, secondary, and then maybe even some tertiary prevention in this space. What can we do to be working on those levels? Because the thing that's struck me with these prepper videos is that they're all basically households or small communities of half a dozen people who are fortifying these bits of the earth. But the reality is, you know, if we do hit some sort of Armageddon, then they're not going to survive on their own. Somebody's going to come and get them. We only get through this if we get through this all together. And so while I think, you know, the military has a role, what I'm hoping senior military people are doing is not just thinking about their bottom line and what money they can draw out of national budgets. I mean, the danger is that's what the military industrial complex will be thinking. But whether they're actually leaning on parliamentarians to be building the sort of, you know, international governance structures that we need to recognize that, you know, it's not just China or the US that's going to go down. We all go down, or we all survive together. And so I think maybe that is the PHAA role, is beginning to work out, you know, what we can do in this space. Although, you know, it's hard because it's something the peace movement has been trying to do for 50 years with pretty marginal success. And, well, with some success, but now we've got the resurgence of the right and preppers and ultra-nationalism to contend with as well.
So it may hearten you to hear that the scariest thing I ever heard, that person, his advice to the audience, and I gather his advice to government was, there is a point past which the military cannot protect you. We will not be able to do our fundamental job. And to me, that is a sort of vote for governance. But, you know, governance is great, and I don't want to discount it, but it really seems like the simple thing is just to limit environmental degradation and climate change.
Agreed.
And that requires stronger both local, national and international governance, so that we're making the decisions that we need to be setting up the systems to do that.
I think for that, our advocacy needs to get even stronger, especially in the current political climate challenges that we are facing.
Yes.
Well,
how do we get... Sorry, Lee.
No, it's fine. I was going to say I'm conscious of the time, but please continue.
I was going to invite Steffi to say anything if she chose.
Or he.
Or he. She or he is on mute though, so. And perhaps left the room some time ago. But
please come in and just say hello.
Okay, let's if they want to stay quiet, that's cool.
Yeah.
What were you about to say, Peter?
I've forgotten.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Well, look, we are at the end of the session, so I suggest adjourning here, but I do think that some very, very interesting topics have come up that we certainly need to start having some conversations with the EESIG about, and really beyond, and upping our advocacy and our policy and our plans on that. I know that when's our next meeting, Peter? Because we've got a core committee meeting coming up, haven't we, over the strategy?
Yes, that's sometime
like
a little bit further on in June. Let me just look at my diary.
It's like the 10th of June, somewhere around there, isn't it?
possible. It looks like it didn't make it into my diary.
I think I had us down as the week of the 10th of June, but I wasn't sure if it was the Tuesday or the Thursday.
Okay. It could be the Thursday because I have this vague memory it was going to clash with one of the ANU Film Group movies that I was thinking I might go and see, but not necessarily totally sold on going to see. So that could be the 13th. I don't know if we lined something up with Rodrigo yet.
No, we haven't, but we should do. And then obviously people who are here, if they want to continue this chat, I guess it would be okay if you came along, even if you're not core group.
The core groups are always open.
Yeah. And we can discuss how we really implement some of these ideas and issues that we've talked about into the strategy and beyond, really. I don't know if you agree with that, Peter.
I'm happy to entertain that possibility. And the idea I forgot about was in communicating these big, hairy, scary ideas, we need to start getting hold of some of the psychological communications literature so that if we're going to be doing this, we're going to be doing it in a productive rather than a counterproductive way. And I've read, George Marshall's book, Why You Can't Talk About Climate Change, and got some stuff out of there. And then there was some stuff that's gone around the Climate Action Network recently looking at some of these issues. And so it strikes me that maybe we need to have one of these sessions on thinking about this communications aspect of how do we talk to ourselves without scaring ourselves to death, much as talk to somebody else without scaring them to death.
I think that's a great idea, and maybe if we could find somebody, that could be the next webinar, because I think that would be really useful.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd second that too.
Yeah, I'd be very interested in it.
Okay, so I'll think about it, but if anyone else can think about it and comes across any names of somebody who would be able to do this, that would be really helpful.
I'll check with my partner, Peter, who has a bit of a developing interest in this and has been starting to collect resources and contacts. If I come across anything, I'll forward it to you.
Thank you. Would they be brave enough to talk to us?
I'll put that and see what happens.
Because in a way, even if it's just an introductory sort of, this is what the landscape is starting to look like, then that might give us an idea about where we go.
Yeah.
Another possibility, I'm not sure, but I saw Mike Smithson, who's at the ANU, give a talk where he mentioned some of it. So I don't know how core it is to his research. I think he's largely into method, but he's a very smart guy, so it wouldn't surprise me if he were into that and other things also.
Yep.
Hello, can I just introduce myself? I'm Fiona Bailey. I'm Roscoe's wife.
Hello, Fiona.
Hi.
Hi there. I just want to thank you all so much for making this opportunity available. And I was sort of, as I think Roscoe said, I sat in and listened. It's such an important topic and very, very compelling. I'm also very interested in my background is kind of working as a counsellor and very interested in the psychological effects of climate change, and looking at basically the defense mechanisms we use to try and deal with the enormity of this, and denial being a key defense mechanism. But I went in February this year to a conference, and the conference was on trauma, and the key speaker that was the most outstanding speaker presenter was a woman by the name of Merle Conyer, and she spoke about climate change and as a trauma, as in relation to trauma, and sort of talking about, she invited us as counsellors to think about when do we, or do we ask our clients about the impact of climate change on their lives, and how, and that sort of the ambience of this existential crisis on, and how we kind of go about things. So as a speaker talking, or presenter talking around the issues of psychology and the impact, she's fabulous. So that may be of interest to you. And just going back to what was said earlier on, I guess I think about the way to engage people is, in a sense, to engage their hope and the positive, because there's so much fear, and fear tends to shut us down and to put us, as you've talked about, into a place of conflict where we get into a fearful survival place, and then we're not generating positive and hopeful and generative ideas. We're going into shutdown and going to the lowest common denominator. So I guess those are just some thoughts that I had from the conversation tonight. And again, thank you so much for having this opportunity available.
Thank you, Fiona.
Yes, thank you.
So carrying that message then forward, maybe we'll do a little bit more thinking about the next session, which I guess will be in about, I'm just trying to juggle it here between, I mean, we're trying to do these things monthly. 6 weeks seems to be being more realistic, which will put us towards the end of or middle of July. But let's park that thought for a moment, and we can come back to that then at the core group meeting next fortnight, in 2 weeks. And then yeah, so maybe, yeah, we'll pick it up out of session, but also in 2 weeks on the 13th. So I think we did decide the 13th would be the core group meeting. So we'll go with that. If you want to follow that up with Rodrigo, please, Lee.
Yeah, I will. I had that week. I just wasn't sure of the day. So I'll send Rodrigo a message now.
Cool. All right. Are you hosting, Lee?
I believe, well, I don't think I'm officially hosting in terms of the website, but yeah, I guess I am metaphorically hosting.
Well, I'm wondering if you're hosting this session tonight.
I can host. Yeah, so thank you once again to Devon. That was, yeah, it was really good, really useful. And thank you everyone for your input and your conversation. Like we say, we'll be holding the eSig core group meeting on the 13th. An email will go out about that. It will go, I believe, to our core group. So if you want to become part of that, just let us know and we let Rodrigo know. Is that right, Peter?
Yep.
Yep, awesome. And hopefully then when we have the core group meeting, we can chat further about the next webinar session and get that set up and hopefully see you all there as well.
Good.
Yo, thank you.
Great. Thank you for coming, everyone.
Thanks
Thank you.
very much again, and especially to Devon. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you, Devon, and good night.
Thank you. Yeah. Sorry, I'm fading. Good
That's
night.
all right.
Get well done, Devon.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You do. Bye-bye.
Sleep well.